All right, so if you've already watched part one, this is part two of our very first interview on this channel. It's not the first one we posted, but we're posting it now. If you haven't watched part one, go ahead, go back and watch part one, or you can just pick up right here and watch part two and watch part one later. And there's also a part three coming.
And I suppose you can say the state of affairs lasted more or less until 1867, right? Of course, the first half of the 19th century for the Habsburg Empire is very storied. You have the Napoleonic Wars that rage from the beginning of the century until 1815 with Napoleon's defeat. Then you have this, I guess you can call it the conservative restoration in Europe over the next 20, 25 years with the outbreak of the 1848-49 revolutions in Europe, trying to overturn that order. And then, of course, when those forces of revolution are defeated and Europe tries to clamp or revert to that previous situation, they don't see that as very viable, or at the very least in the case of the Austrians. And maybe we can talk about how this 1867 Ausgleich comes about.
Well, after the suppression of the revolution of 1848 in the Austrian lands, you had a new emperor, Franz Joseph, who stays on the throne now from 1848 until 1916. So he's the longest reigning monarch in European history up to that point. Now I think he's succeeded by Elizabeth II. So in the 1850s, Franz Joseph rejected constitutionalism, although he had previously promised that he would issue a constitution. But in the early 1850s, he decided against it. But what he did do was to adhere to the dynasty's tradition of the Rechtsstaat and the Enlightenment principles behind it. Remember that his second name is Joseph. That was the name given him in honor of Joseph II. So he does represent a sort of red line, you might say, that runs through the dynastic history of the monarchy from Maria Theresia forward, of the notion of the state having an obligation to increase the well-being of its subject and to base itself on the rule of law. So the 1850s, even though it doesn't result in, they don't result in a constitution, they do result in an extension of the rule of law and of modernization of the state and its institutions. So that that decade results in a lot of improvements and further modernization along the lines of what's going on in the rest of Europe. Now, at the end of the 1850s, Austria engages in a losing war with the Kingdom of Piedmont and the Second French Empire over basically the future of Italy. And although it loses, it does retain the territory of Venice and Venice's territory on land. But generally, this is a defeat, which damages the prestige of the state and the notion that it can rule without a constitution. And so the basically the middle class, which is the politically active group, which is also the part of society that is creating the Austrian Industrial Revolution. It's the group that sees itself as most progressive. It's also the group that advocates for constitutionalism. And it now has leverage over Franz Joseph in that Franz Joseph wants to rebuild the power base of the monarchy as quickly as possible and consolidate his authority after this defeat. And the only way he can do that is by pleasing this essentially middle class political group that wants a liberal style constitutional monarchy. So from 1860 until the outbreak of the Austro-Prussian War in 1866, Franz Joseph and his ministers go through a series of expedients and compromises to come up with a viable constitutional document. From the side of Franz Joseph, he wanted as much as possible to retain the notion of a centralized unitary state in which power was held in Vienna, and that you wouldn't have any of the constituent parts autonomous, the way Hungary had been. I should point out, Hungary loses that autonomy after the suppression of the revolution and the Hungarian revolt in 1849 by virtue of them having tried to break away from the dynasty. So their constitution is canceled and they lose their autonomy. On the other hand, these liberal constitutionalists are advocating for more autonomy in the crown lands and setting up a more modern system of municipal law. In other words, creating a more liberal political structure, while in Hungary, the Hungarian elites, political elites, are trying to push for a reconstitution of Hungary's historical autonomy and its old notion of an independent kingdom under dynastic rule. In 1866, Austria goes to war with Prussia over the leadership of what by that time is now the Germanic Confederation. Is Prussia going to lead under Bismarck, or is Austria going to lead a German confederation in which most of its states are, independent and just loosely associated, rather than under a version of a German nation under Prussian control? Austria loses the war. So this gives a big opening to the liberal constitutionalists and to the Hungarians. Again, in order to rebuild Austria's power base as quickly as possible, because Franz Joseph originally wanted to have another showdown with Prussia at a future date, which never takes place. But in 1866, 67, that seemed a possible reality. He makes concessions, agrees to have a liberal constitution with a parliament, representatives who are sent by vote, a Bill of Rights, everything that liberals think is appropriate to a constitution, and to avoid a attempt by Hungary to possibly secede again from the empire, he concedes Hungarian autonomy, agrees that Hungary can have its own constitution, its own ministries, and be, in terms of its domestic affairs, independent for the most part. But it has to remain under the Habsburgs, although now Franz Joseph consents to be crowned King of Hungary. So after 1867, he's King of Hungary and Emperor of Austria. I should make one clarification about that. He becomes Emperor of Austria during the Napoleonic period as a counter to Napoleon crowning himself emperor. The fear was that Napoleon was imminently going to end the Holy Roman Empire by fiat, because essentially he was in control of it already. And the Habsburgs did not want to lose the imperial title. So they create their own imperial title and announce it and become emperors of Austria, and temporarily also emperors of the Holy Roman Empire until it's abolished in 1806. So that's why you have that title. That in 1867, Franz Joseph is Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. He's also King of Bohemia, but that's another story. I don't want to get into too much detail. So you have the dawn of the so-called constitutional era in Austria, which lasts until 1918. Now, something should be made clear, though, about Franz Joseph and the constitutional era. Virtually all of the major elements of the Austrian constitution already existed in laws and documents which had been developed since Maria Theresia's reign. There were some additions. I'm not saying that there's nothing new in that constitution, creating an explicit Bill of Rights that defines the rights of the citizen. That document had not existed as a document, as a separate specific document, but most of what's in it existed already in Austrian law. So this reflects how well entrenched already the idea of the rule of law and the principles that that concept provided for liberal ideology already existed within the structure of the Habsburg state and what had become its raison d'etre by that time. So it was really not much of a sacrifice for Franz Joseph to agree to be a constitutional monarch, since he already had, and his dynasty had already bound themselves to be monarchs within the structure of the rule of law. So the Constitution just made this more explicit and sort of rounded out the rough edges, you might say.
There was an institutional infrastructure already taking place that they were willingly submitting themselves to for continuity, right?
Yeah. And, this also underlines another thing is that, Austrian liberals were not revolutionaries. They had no real grievance against the dynasty and the way the state was. They couldn't have existed except that the Habsburgs had already adopted the notion of the rule of law. They prospered as a result. Moreover, most of the bureaucracy supplied a lot of the intelligentsia in the Liberal Party. That is, those who are advocating for constitutionalism.
Does the monarchy experience any new issues with the different nationalities that it's governing from this period, from about 1867 to 1914?
Well, ironically, the very liberal character of the Constitution in its guarantees to all of the nationalities within the Austrian half of the empire, meaning their rights to their language and to their culture and equal treatment, opened the door to the nationality conflicts that used to be pointed to as a sign that the Habsburg monarchy was a state in decline, because there were all these political issues that revolved around the rights of national groups. Plus the fact that Hungary had so much independence within the empire, and that its connection to the notion of a unified state was based on a very difficult set of arrangements that gave the Hungarians, many would say, undue influence over the way decisions were made at the center, and allowed them to get away with not paying their fair share of taxes, of being able to cause difficulties for the empire as a whole based on their own interests.
Would it be accurate to say that the nationalities issue would continue to be a thorn in the side of the monarchy up until the outbreak of the war in 1914?
Yeah, it's a problem that has to be dealt with, but the old, as I say, the old interpretations used to be that, this was the sign that this was an empire with a sickness unto death. And, that it was inevitable that it would come to an end. And that's all you have to do if you want an explanation. That it was the prison house of nations, as one contemporary called it. But, in fact, Austria had difficulties, but Austria was dealing with all these difficulties. It wasn't sitting on its hands, mainly through the bureaucracy. Parliament, after the incident of the Badeni language decrees, which was where the then prime minister in the Austrian half of the empire issued a set of ordinances to give basically equality to Czech and German in the Bohemian bureaucracy, caused a huge reaction among some very small German nationalist party that fanned the flames of German fears within Bohemia that the Czechs were going to take over, and so resulted in really pitched battles in the lower chamber of the Austrian parliament over this issue, with people throwing inkwells at each other and at their colleagues with their pens. And the police actually had to be brought in at one time, and provoking demonstrations and riots in Vienna and Prague and other cities.
And was it also true that sometimes these parliamentarians did not even understand what each other was saying because was there an official language for use? Wow.
I mean, technically, everybody could use their own language. And then there was supposed to be translation. I mean, the unwritten norm, well, maybe I shouldn't say norm, but what was accepted in the beginning was that German was the one language that everybody spoke. And all of those deputies, for the most part, knew German, could speak German. You couldn't be an educated person in Austria-Hungary before 1914 and not know German. I mean, even the Hungarian elites knew German, and they're the ones who were most, adamant about Hungarian language and cultural rights. And certainly in the Austrian half of the empire, these deputies were, for the most part, university educated. So they had to have known German.
Yeah, I do recall reading an excerpt about how there may have been one particular Czech parliamentarian who would go and filibuster while the parliament was in session, and everybody would just have really no choice but to sit down and listen, and there really was no other option to do anything because you also had to respect his right to his time. So it's
there were certainly incidents like that. But the problem is that after 1898, these kinds of disruptions become almost regular events. I mean, there are periods of calm. After the introduction of universal manhood suffrage in 1907, things calmed down for a few years because the more popular base for election to parliament tended to result in an electorate that wanted deputies to deal with social and economic issues. And so the nationality problems went on the back burner. But they flared up again by 1910. Yeah. So what happens is that the bureaucracy, the central bureaucracy in Vienna, tries a whole series of reforms, and basically on its own initiative begins to tackle major issues through administrative means and negotiations with the main political interests in the crown lands outside of parliament. So what you get is a series of small compromises, or sort of mini Ausgleichs, I call them, in
little arrangements.
That's right, little compromises among the nationality groups in the crown lands. So for instance, in the Bukovina, you end essentially conflict there. In Galicia, conflict between the Ruthenian majority and the Polish minority is resolved in an agreement that was to go into effect, I think, in 1915 or 1916. But basically that had been signed. Moravia gets a compromise. And the state was working on a compromise, which was the biggest issue, the Czech-German conflict in Bohemia, when war broke out. Now, there's also a problem with these compromises because to some extent it hardened the divisions of national identity within these crown lands, because the core of these compromises granted language education rights, schools, proportional representation, and so forth. And that forced populations that previously had not really thought of themselves in hard and fast terms as one national group or another to legally have to declare themselves to be, for instance, either Ruthenian or Polish or Czech or German. Whereas before that, those divisions had not been so great, and that much of the nationalist agitation had been by the middle class liberals who had absorbed the ideology of national identity and were pushing that and forcing it on a population that was not that clear cut all the time in its national sentiments.
And maybe just one last question as we round up this conversation. Can we draw any comparisons between how the Habsburgs went about resolving their issues in managing these large multi-ethnic populations and their neighbors in these other imperial formations like the Russians or the Ottomans? And perhaps we can be very brief about it because as you can probably imagine, this will be a conversation in and of itself.
Yeah. Well, I think the Habsburgs actually did a better job than their neighbors and did it with good faith, in their attempts. The Germans did not handle their minorities well at all. In Alsace-Lorraine, they tried to essentially force the French-speaking population to become a German-speaking population, and they were trying to push out the Polish population in East Prussia and Silesia. There was a league formed to buy out Polish land owners and get them to leave the empire. None of that goes on in Austria-Hungary. I mean, the Hungarians are notorious for maltreating the Romanians and trying to force them to adopt a Hungarian identity. That's true. But in the Austrian half, that's not the case. And in Russia, Russia tried to force Russification on various populations under its control, used military force and state power to control the non-Russian population and its own ethnic Russian population.
We should clarify this is especially under the reigns of Alexander III, who reigns from 1881 to, I believe, 1894, and his son Tsar Nicholas II, who reigns up until effectively the Russian Revolution in 1917. But until, I think, 1905, when this other revolution breaks out in Russia, he essentially continues these policies that you're discussing with Russification, and really Russia becomes synonymous with autocracy.
Yeah, although Germany also considered itself to be a Rechtsstaat, but the Russian Empire is not a Rechtsstaat, and its dynasty never adopts an identity associated with the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Nor does the Russian bureaucracy, for that matter. Um, so I would say that Austria, this might to some will seem an extreme claim, but I would say that Austria is the only state in Europe that consistently based itself on Enlightenment principles and the rule of law. Now, in part, that's because of a necessity. I mean, you could argue that France, the home of the Enlightenment and the Revolution, certainly saw itself as a state, based on the rule of law with that inheritance. But, France also bases itself on a national identity. And Austria has no national identity. Austria, in its modern legitimacy, needs to be an Enlightenment state, a state based on the rule of law, because that's the only principle that you can truly make universal in a state like Austria-Hungary.
Yeah. And in the case of the Ottomans, since I am the one here who's also studying the Ottomans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, I suppose they just had too many things going against them, with, on the one hand, having these rapacious imperial powers all along their borders with the Russians, and also British and French just nibbling away at different parts of their empire, which spanned, of course, across 3 continents. And then you also had certain rulers who perhaps were not doing any favors for their own subjects. As the course that you and Professor Mustafa Aksakal were teaching at Georgetown last year on the Habsburgs and Ottomans, we gained a sense of how beleaguered the Ottomans were, and under the reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid, and how this Committee of Union and Progress, which unseats him effectively in 1909, kind of is out of their element, or out of their depth, because you have these army officers and bureaucrats trying to govern an empire which is coming apart at its seams. I know it's a very large topic, but I think perhaps that may encapsulate the number of issues which the Ottomans themselves were facing, and they could only look with some, I guess, jealousy or resentment at how the Austro-Hungarians appear to perhaps have gone the right formula.
Yeah, I mean, what happens to the Ottomans is very problematic. I hesitate to apply what are basically European models, predicated on a European philosophical basis, i.e. the Enlightenment, to the Ottoman Empire. I can, more easily make that kind of comparison and critique as I just did with the German Empire and the Russian Empire.
Right.
But of course, the Ottomans potentially had a tradition that could have lent itself to something like the way the Habsburgs solved their problem, because they already had a multinational empire. They had a structure that involved tolerance and autonomy, as well as a traditional structure that involved acceptance of a hierarchical order of things and a divinely legitimated ruler and state, but no real mechanism, I would say, that could expand those principles to encompass dramatic change, and never really put itself at the head of that change. And I think that's one of the strengths of the Habsburgs. By making the state the engine of progress in a conscious way, which is what the Enlightenment is, very little basis to challenge the state as a positive institution. Even in 1848, there was no real challenge to the state. Rather, there was a call for, the introduction of constitutionalism and liberal ideology to be attached to that state.
Yeah,
it's not accidental that there's no revolution outside of France in 1789, particularly in Central Europe, not just in the Austrian lands, but in the German lands, because those are the parts of Europe that adopted the idea of the Enlightenment and of the state as the repository of Enlightenment ideas and the rule of law.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating, this is the last comment I'll make on the subject, is how after this revolution that takes place in the Ottoman Empire in 1908, where the constitution that had been suspended 30 years earlier is restored, you have Ottomans who look toward the European models and seem to see something right. And I recall reading one interview that was published in an Ottoman Armenian newspaper where it was conducted between the editor and the Greek patriarch of Constantinople, where they were saying that the model that applies best to the Ottoman case, or that perhaps we would like to have, is not the French nation state as we're seeing it form in this time, but rather the Austro-Hungarians. So again, it's just very interesting to see those transnational connections at this time.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Michael, do we finally tackle the First World War now?
Why don't we go to the movie first, and then if we have time, we'll get to those other questions.
So we are discussing 1917, which was released, I think, December of last year, and everybody I know has gone and seen this film, and Professor Shedel and I had many lively conversations over it at the department earlier this year before COVID. And we had a lot of things to pick apart at it, but perhaps I'll just provide a very quick summary of the film, and maybe Michael, you can tackle it from the cinematic elements of the plot and narrative, what you thought it did well and what it didn't. So 1917 is based on two British soldiers who are serving on the Western Front, as the title of the film suggests, in 1917, when the Germans, and correct me if I get this wrong, Professor, the Germans pull out of certain positions, it's a strategic withdrawal, and create a defensive line known as the Hindenburg line. And they essentially set up a trap, thinking that when the Allied forces advance, they will be able in a much better position to counter their offensives. But two British soldiers apparently get wind, or the British High Command gets wind of this trap, and they dispatch these soldiers to inform a line of troops on the front who are going to be sent up across the trenches to attack the German positions, not knowing that they're in for a very rude surprise. And the entire film, or perhaps the first half of this film, is based on these two soldiers trying to make their way to inform their comrades before things take a very bad turn. And Michael, you can say what you think about it.
Actually, before I put in my 2 cents, I'm curious about your discussions, what you guys, Professor, you and Armen had, because there are things I liked about the movie and things I didn't like about the movie, but rather than tainting your reaction, I'd like to get it cold before I say anything.
Well, I mean, in general, I thought it was a good movie. I enjoyed it. And I also thought, in the main, it was an accurate depiction. However, it had a couple of problems, one of which was really glaring, in my opinion, another one not quite so problematic. And the one that was glaring was the scene where these two soldiers are by a ruined farm.
And I should just say that this is also a spoiler alert for those who haven't watched the film.
Yeah.
Hey, it's been out long enough. It's your fault if you haven't seen it. So.
So anyway, they're by this ruined farm in a field, and they see this German plane is being shot down in a dogfight. And they watch it, and then they realize that it's going to crash into this ruined barn near where they are. So they run to avoid, getting hit by this plane. So the plane crashes, and then they go up to the plane, and they rescue this German pilot who's still alive. And they get him out in the nick of time before the plane blows up. So he's wounded, and they take him, and one of the soldiers stays with him while the other guy goes to get some water to help him. And they tell him that, they're going to help him and that he's safe now. So while the one soldier is going to get the water, the German, for no reason at all, apparently, takes out a knife, isn't it, I think, Armen?
Yeah, it's nice.
And stabs the British soldier who's caring for him for no reason. And so then, of course, the other soldier rushes to his friend's aid and, kills the guy.
Why does this scene, stick out?
A big problem in the movie, to me, is number one, there's no motivation for this German to kill people who are taking care of him, who told him they are. Secondly, he's in all likelihood either an aristocrat and at the very least an officer who would have had a set of values that did not involve, basically murdering a soldier of the opposite side when they're trying to take care of you. So it's not in character, either in terms of what this individual should be like, nor in terms of what we know about, the kinds of individuals who were flying in the German Air Force during the war. It was stuck in there just so you could get rid of the other soldier, and then have the movie concentrate on one guy whose brother happens to be an officer in the brigade that is going to head into an ambush. So that way you can create more tension, I guess, and a greater personal link between one character and another, and his duty to try and get to that section of the front to warn these troops, because he's also going to save his brother. The other part that I had a problem with, which is not as big a problem as this business with the German pilot, is our surviving soldier is going into the evacuated area, and he's marching with a group of British troops who are going in to occupy it. He breaks off from them because he has to go in another direction. He goes on along a canal, and a building that belongs to the canal regulating system or whatever it is there, and a sniper opens fire on him. So he avoids getting killed. He could easily go around that building, avoid the sniper, and carry out his duty in a timely fashion, because everybody knows he's got to get there by a certain hour or these troops are going to walk into the ambush. But instead, he decides to go after the sniper. So he goes into the building, he finally finds the sniper, they exchange fire, he gets knocked out, he wakes up and it's nighttime, and so now he's late by several hours. He's got to go through this abandoned town, which turns out to be not so abandoned. He gets delayed when he finds this young girl and baby in a cellar. He helps them. Then he goes back out, and there are all these German troops who are going around setting fire to things and who go after him, and he just barely escapes. And then he gets himself into some more difficulties, and then finally, he gets to the section of the trenches that he's supposed to be. With some difficulty, convinces the commanding officer that what he's telling them is true, and that it needs to call back the troops who have already started going forward, but at least they haven't gone all the way, so it's not as big a disaster as it would be. So those are my qualms, my peeves with the movie.
Yeah, and
welcome to Hollywood.
Yeah.
Just one thing to also clarify with the scene with the pilot professor was that since you mentioned that he may have been an aristocrat, did not the pilots who were engaged in these dogfights sometimes adhere to or thought they would adhere to a chivalric code? So there were modes of combat which, perhaps for somebody who's witnessing combat or warfare in battlefields around the world today, may not necessarily recognize, or it may be a little bit difficult to comprehend, that there's almost this gentlemanly relationship between the adversaries, at least at this time.
No, that's exactly correct. And, even if you weren't an aristocrat, and this is true, for the French and the British air arms as well as the German, that set of values was the dominant set of values among airmen. That you were on a one-to-one basis when you were up in the air fighting these guys. It wasn't anonymous. And of course, in some cases like von Richthofen, everybody felt that they were, engaged with him if you were on the other side. So the notion of an aristocratic set of values that were chivalric was not just limited to the aristocrats who happened to be officers in these air corps. Also the non-aristocrats who entered in, all of them were officers. Everyone who flew was an officer. And so the officer corps in all armies in World War I had essentially an aristocratic notion of behavior. That was the basis of their notion of what an officer and a gentleman was. And it was particularly strong in the Air Corps because of this one-to-one individualistic element in the kind of fighting that took place in the air.
These kinds of codes of honor or respect for your enemy.
Yeah, that if somebody was shot down on the other side, it wasn't uncommon to bring some of their possessions, fly over the airfield and drop them, with a note, saying, here's so-and-so's scarf and, his wallet or whatever. Send it to his widow.
Different times.
Yep. So that's why it makes it so anomalous to have that scene with the German airmen.
Well, it's good to hear that from you. In fact, before I heard that response, when I watched the movie, it did strike me as it just seemed like an irrational choice, right? Like in the script, like it colored the German army as murderous. I understand in World War II, the Japanese had kamikaze pilots that their goal was to die for the honor of their nation, but I didn't get that impression. Certainly from World War I, Germans wouldn't do something like that.
No.
And that's the only mentality I could think of why he would just want to kill this guy, because I don't know, go down fighting for the honor of your nation. But even in the story structure of the film, I thought I know it was a device they needed. Like you mentioned, they needed that one character to die, and here's how they wrote it into the script. But it did not ring true when I saw it. But one of my main issues with the film is, I guess, ironically, one of the kind of revolutionary parts of the film. So part of the marketing is it's all one shot, right? This entire film, is technologically constructed. It's not literally one shot, but it's one sequential, shot through the entire film. And though I think it was extremely effective in a lot of places, and I mean, technologically it was done very, very well, but that actually detracts from the storytelling in certain instances. And that was one of the instances when that co-lead, when the guy's buddy is murdered by the German pilot, it was a shocking moment. And so the surviving friend is traumatized, and because they're in this remote farm village where there's nobody else around. There's no way he can save his friend's life. And so he has this moment of 20 to 30 seconds where he grieves for the loss of his friend.
Right.
And 30 seconds later, there's this, column of infantry and military marching right by that he joins with. And because they had to do it in one sequential shot, pacing wise, they couldn't make it like 5 minutes later that he finally sees them off in the distance and joins them. They were right there. And literally, if it was literally about 30 to 60 seconds maximum from when he's mourning his friend's death to when he's marching with these guys. He would have heard them in the distance, or the friend of the column would have been right there. Medic, I need a medic. So, it pulls you out. Structurally, they had to do it that way to keep the flow going. But because they were a slave to the technique, a slave to the notion that we're going to do it in one shot, that was one example. There are other examples where the trick they were using actually detracted. It pulls you out. And the whole point of telling a story in film is for you not to know you're watching a film, right? You're supposed to go in there and be the character and root for him and everything. And anything that pulls you out, even if it's a special effect or something, even anything that pulls you out of the story is actually detracting from the film. Now, I agree. It was a great film, and it's still on my list of recommended films. Anybody who wants to, be entertained and educated because of the realism in the film, the quality of the film and the realism, it's still worth seeing. But I have real qualms with certain things.
I have one quibble with it too, which is, I think, maybe, more than just a quibble. Toward the end of the film, you guys may recall there's this scene where the soldier who does successfully inform the commander to call off this attack is told by the commander that it doesn't really matter. Next week, they'll send out another, brigade into combat, and the casualties are going to be devastating, as we know how World War I battles usually unfolded. And for me, that was such a jarring line, because it almost sounded as if the sacrifice of this young man and his comrade in arms was for naught, because if the whole notion was that we have to save these men before they go into attack, if the following week most of these guys are going to be wiped out by German machine gun fire or artillery, it almost beggars the belief, and to think that, well, maybe the mission, to make you think that the mission itself was all for, didn't really accomplish anything ultimately.
Well, of course, that's also part of the tradition, so to speak, of how World War I is viewed, that it was pointless, that people died for nothing. And I also say that you see that kind of statement and attitude in other films about World War I. That people are going to get sacrificed anyway. And, for instance, I can't remember the title, but there's a fairly well-known film about the air war produced in the early 30s, with, I think, Errol Flynn was in it and Basil Rathbone. And in any event, everybody is always talking about, well, we have to go and do our duty, even though we're all going to be shot down and we're not coming back. And then, of course, only a handful come back, and everybody gets bitter and talks about how the war is terrible and that it's pointless, and we're sending children up in planes, and they're all going to die. And you can see that in other films produced after the war, because post-war attitudes about World War I think, were much more pessimistic than post-war attitudes about World War II.